song. And when the Apostle Paul over in Ephesians 3 talks about his dream for us, his hope and wish and prayer for us is that we might know the length and breadth and depth and height, to know the love of Christ. Obviously, it's important. If we understand how much we're loved and how much has been done for us, it will help us to have the right mindset, the right determination. And it'll make all the difference. So I'm grateful for that song and for its encouragement. Grateful for your being here. It's our purpose tonight to get back to the book of 1 Corinthians and to think again about this great letter as we're going through it. I said when we started out, I think it's a very challenging passage. And if you're a student of this book, you know that's so. There are a number of passages in 1 Corinthians that are difficult, somewhat controversial, and I think that tonight's subject is perhaps in that category. At least for me, as a fellow who's been reading this book for a few years and trying to understand it, I have to admit to you, and I hate to start a lesson this way, I still have questions myself about this verse, so I'm not going to teach you what I don't know, I'm going to teach you what I do know, and I'm going to encourage you to think carefully about it as well and help me if I have missed the point. When you think about this passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, that'll be our focus tonight, 1 Corinthians 6, and the first 8 verses, I think you get a glimpse into the society of the times, and I think you get a glimpse as well of the church there at Corinth. And another problem that they were facing. The old translation reads, 1 Corinthians 6:1, "Dare any of you, having a matter against another, to go to law before the unjust and not before the saints? Do you not know that the saints shall judge the world? And if the world shall be judged by you, are ye unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Know ye not that we shall judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life? If then ye have judgments of things pertaining to this life, set them to judge who are least esteemed in the church." He said, "I speak to your shame. Is it so that there is not a wise man among you? No, not one that shall be able to judge between his brethren? But brother goes to law with brother, and that before the unbelievers. Now therefore, there is utterly a fault among you, because you go to law one with another. Why do you not rather take wrong? Why do you not rather suffer yourselves to be defrauded? Nay, you do wrong and defraud, and that your brethren." So, what should we do with this? Well, we remember the context here, something about that. We've already, in our studies, noted in Paul's letter how divided the church there was. You go back to chapter 1, if you have your Bible there open, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 10, "I beseech you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all speak the same thing, that there be no divisions among you, that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and the same judgment. It's been declared unto me of you, my brethren, by them which are of the house of Chloe, that there are contentions among you. Now this I say, that every one of you saith, I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas, I am of Christ." Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? So we talked in a lesson about their overemphasis on men, on mere human beings, and how that was too much, there was too much emphasis placed upon that as opposed to what they ought to have been emphasizing, which was, of course, Christ. Look with me now in the 3rd chapter of 1 Corinthians, and in verse 1. We also looked at this passage in an earlier lesson. "And I, brethren, could not speak unto you as unto spiritual, but as unto carnal. But even as unto babes in Christ, I have fed you with milk and not strong, or that with not meat. For hitherto you were not able to bear it, neither ye yet now are ye able. For ye are yet carnal. For whereas there is among you envying and strife and divisions, are ye not carnal and walk as men? This was a divided church, a church that did not speak as they should have spoken, did not have the same view of one another as they should have. There was not the unity that there should have been. As we continue on, hopefully we'll get to chapter 11 soon, in verse 21 of 1 Corinthians, he says, in eating, talking about the Lord's Supper, everyone takes before his own supper, and one is hungry and another is drunken. They couldn't worship together. In the 14th chapter of 1 Corinthians, and in verse 26, how is it, brethren, when you come together, every one of you has a psalm, a doctrine, a tongue, a revelation, an interpretation, that all things be done unto edifying. If you had visited with the church at Corinth at this time, it would not have taken you long to figure out these folks are not on the same page. They don't have the right spirit toward one another, the same love toward one another. They don't treat each other with consideration. Everybody's got their own thing. It's almost as if we got more than one church in this building or wherever they met. And that's right. And so now we come to our passage. And in that context, a divided church, a carnal church, Paul said. Carnal in this regard, that they did not show the love of Christ that we sang about earlier toward one another. Now they were guilty of taking each other to law. I thought this comment to be interesting. This is from William Barclay's commentary. And he offers this historical perspective. He said that the Greeks were naturally and characteristically a litigious people. They loved to go. By the way, aren't you glad that can't be said of our society? How many billboards do you drive by every day that said, we'll sue anybody for a nickel, just give us a call. We don't care who it is, or we don't care what it is. If we think we can win the case, we'll. The law courts were, in fact, one of their chief amusements. Not unnaturally, certain of the Greeks had brought their litigious tendencies into the Christian church. Gentiles in Corinth, they knew their way to the law courts. It was almost a sport with some people. It was a way of making money with some people as well. Nothing new about using the law in order to try to gain some financial benefit on other people. So Christians coming out of that society sometimes didn't leave that mindset behind. And that was true, it seems, in the church at Corinth. So Paul starts out in the first verse of our text saying, how dare you do this? How dare you, having a matter against another, go to law before the unjust and not before the saints? What kind of nerve? How much gall does it take for you to do this, to take this course? Having a matter, having a grievance, having a complaint, having a dispute with another Christian, various translations of that. To go to law before the unjust. There seems to be something very purposeful about that word. What he seems to be contrasting is you go to those who do not have forgiveness with God. They are unjust, and you look for justice among the unjust. What sense does this make? How can you justify this? One modern speech translation reads, how dare you go to court to settle the matter in front of wicked people? Why don't you settle it in front of God's holy people? And there's the contrast. Verses 2 and 3. Do you not know that the saints shall judge the world? And if the world shall be judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Do you not know that we shall judge angels? And there's one of the great questions of the passage. What in the world does he mean when he talks about us judging the world or judging angels? How are we to understand that? Well, that's a fair question. There are several ways in which that's been answered by religious people. Some people have the view, yes, this is talking about the future millennial kingdom, when the Lord comes back to reign in Jerusalem and an earthly kingdom for 1,000 years, then we'll be up there, we'll be the ones who get the judges' seats in that. That clearly is an unbiblical concept. The Lord is never said to be coming back to the earth, never said to be reigning on the earth again in some literal physical kingdom on a throne in Jerusalem, a literal throne. So we reject that. Another view that is not uncommon among brethren is that we will have some sort of a voice in the judging of the world at the last day. One brother wrote, that final sentence, talking about something yet future, the second coming, that final sentence cannot be pronounced upon the lost without the concurrence of the saved. Really? Another fellow wrote, at the last day the saints shall be Christ's associate judges. I'm not sure about that. Another brother, I'm not sure exactly, he seemed to believe that idea, but he wasn't quite as outspoken about it. But he did offer this thought. He said, the verb shall judge is future, pointing to the second coming of Jesus. There are not very many passages, he said, that relate to the subject of saints participating in the judgment of the world. However, read the following. Matthew 19:28. Well, why don't we read the following? Let's read that. Matthew 19:28. And we'll see what we can find there. Matthew 19:28. The Lord said, verily I say unto you, ye that have followed me, in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit in the throne of his glory, ye shall also sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, well that sounds like it would be connected with this. The thing is, though, I think the way he reads that passage, he's trying to suggest that the regeneration is the final coming of Christ. I don't believe that's so. Are we not made regenerate now? Isn't that what we're called to do? Isn't baptism the washing of regeneration, along with the renewing of the Holy Ghost? And so when Jesus says these words to his disciples, I don't really think he's talking about the final day or the end of the world. I think he's looking at that next dispensation, the gospel age. And by the way, how will men be sorted? They will be sorted by the word given through the apostles. I think we live now in that time of regeneration. So I don't think that if that's what he's pointing to, the last day, I disagree with his application of it. How about Luke 22? That's another verse that he gives. In Luke chapter 22, and in verse 30, Jesus said, verse 29, and I appointed unto you a kingdom as my Father hath appointed unto me, that ye may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Again, is this something we're yet waiting on? Is not the Lord now, are we not eating and drinking with the Lord? Isn't that the point that he made when he gave them the Lord's Supper? He said, I'll eat and drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. I don't think that's yet future. I think that's going on now. I hope it is. And so again, that surprises me that a brother would seem to indicate that's something yet future. And then he points to Revelation. Revelation chapter 2, a couple of passages in Revelation. Revelation 2 and verse 26 and 27. At the end here of this letter to Thyatira. And he that overcometh and keepeth my works unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, and vessels, as the vessels of a potter, they shall be broken into shivers, even as I received of my Father. Okay, and then in chapter 3 and verse 21, the last letter to Laodicea, and here's the last thing that he writes to them or says to them that's written here. To him that overcometh, I will grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame and am set down with my Father in his throne. Well, I think those verses do speak to the end time. I think the term overcome suggests the idea at least of those who have passed through the trials of this life, if I understand it. But I don't see anything there about judging. I see something there about sitting with Christ and reigning with him. But anything else, it seems to me, would be put into the passage. So let me just say another idea that I think fits and perhaps makes the most sense to me and to a lot of other folks. When the Bible talks about our judging the world, at the end. Judging angels. I think he's talking there about judging them by our example. And I believe that is true. The righteous will by their example judge the world. Compare it with a passage like Hebrews 11 and verse 7. This is William's translation of Hebrews 11:7. By faith Noah, on being divinely warned about things not seen as yet, in reverence prepared an ark for the saving of his family, and by his faith condemned the world, and became possessor of the uprightness that results from faith. Now let me ask you a question. How did Noah condemn the world by his faith? When I was in junior high school, there was a kid that went to school with us named Barry. Not my brother here. Another Barry. And Barry was a problem. Probably not for the reasons you might imagine. Barry was smart, good-looking, charming kid. All the teachers loved him. The worst thing about Barry was he studied. It's awful. I mean, we'd have a test and he'd be ready for it always. And so you'd want to whine about the test. This might have been even a little past junior high, because I can remember he was in chemistry. And we'd whine about the test being too hard. You know what the teacher would say? Barry got 100. Barry got 100. Couldn't stand Barry. No, that's not true. I'm teasing a little bit about that. But I'm not teasing about the illustration. Barry showed the rest of us up. And we couldn't say it's not fair. It was fair for Barry. And I think about how that the whole world was wiped out. But nobody could say, well, nobody can please God. Noah pleased God. And by faith he condemned the world. By faith he condemned the world. He judged the world. I think about that passage in Romans chapter 2 and verse 26. If those who have not circumcision keep the rules of the law, will it not be credited to them as circumcision? Paul writes, they by their keeping of the law without circumcision will be judges of you, by whom the law is broken through you. By whom the law is broken through you have the letter of the law and circumcision. Here were the people who had every advantage. The Jew had the law, he had the testimony, he had the word, he had the examples, he had God's direct intervention for him. And then here you have a Gentile who has to see the law from a distance, and he has more of a heart for God and pleasing him than you do. He'll judge you. He'll judge you in the last day. Isn't that sort of what the Lord was talking about in Matthew 12? These famous words, the men of Nineveh shall rise in judgment with this generation and shall condemn it. Going back to the days of Noah, or back to the days of Jonah, I should say. For because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, a greater than Jonah is here. There sure was. So they will condemn you by their good example. And I think that's what he has in mind here. That on the last day, those who have overcome and those who have finished the course are going to condemn the world who made excuses and who put it off and who said it's too hard, or who just were having too busy having their own time, or good time they call it. And so they fail and they're condemned. I think that's the same idea he has in mind with the angels. In the same way, human beings who have overcome by their victory condemn the angels that sinned. And the Bible does make reference to the angels that sinned in a few places. For example, in Jude, in the 6th verse, he has also held in eternal chains those angels who did not keep their own position, but abandon their assigned place, what will they say? When on the day of judgment, you have human beings who had to run the gauntlet of this world and who kept their place. How can they complain? How can they claim somehow that they have an excuse? I think about that with Satan, don't you? Doesn't that resonate in the background of these words, these familiar words in Job 1? The Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? Perfect, upright, feared God, eschewed evil. And here is Satan, who I believe to be a fallen angel. And yet here's a man who can please God when an angel can't, or didn't, or wouldn't. You'll judge angels. The Corinthians claim to be God's chosen people in a lost world. Well, if that's so, why in the world would the children of light go to the children of darkness to try to find answers in the affairs of this life? Let me go back to our text now, 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 4. If then ye have judgment of these things pertaining to life, understanding that where you stand in God's plan of things, you are God's people. And you're here to be the light of the world. And on the day of judgment, your faith will condemn those who were rebellious, even the angels. But you can't handle these matters in the church. You got to run to the courts. If you then have judgments of things pertaining to this life, set them to judge who are least esteemed in the church. I speak to your shame. Is it so that there is not a wise man among you? No, not one that shall be able to judge between his brethren? But brother goes to law with brother, and that before unbelievers. The old King James reads, set the least esteemed in the church to judge. Other translations render that a little differently. The ASV, for example, reads, if then ye have to judge things pertaining to this life, do ye set them to judge who are of no account in the church? As a question, incredulous. I can't believe that you would set the least, so why would you handle it like you're handling it now? The ESV, a little different, reads, so if you have such cases, why do you lay them before those who have no standing in the church? And I think they probably are implying there those who have no standing are not actually in the church, but those of the world. It doesn't really come out all that different. The King James, if it's correct, I think you're speaking ironically. In other words, if this is the correct rendering that we've read in our text, it would be something along this line. Paul would be saying, well, I tell you what, why don't you find the least wise fellow in the church and let him judge it? He'd be better than what you'd find in the world. Just find the common man among the saints, and you'd be better off than this. I speak to your shame. I think there's an irony here, an edge here to these words, in which Paul says, I speak to shame you. They were not handling their own business. We saw that in the last chapter, didn't we? There was gross immorality in the church, and they were not disciplining their own. And now they've added to that the idea of running to the world to try to get answers to the disputes between them. What does that look like? How does that come across? How does the Lord's name fare in a world like that? I may have told some of you before, I don't know why I remember this. Years ago, we were in Pittsburgh, and several of us were up there trying to knock doors and maybe get some interest in a little church that was trying to get on its feet up there. And what we'd do is we'd have a van of us, and the fellows who were local, they'd drive us to a neighborhood. You know, they had their neighborhoods all marked where they wanted to go. And they'd let us out at the corner, and then we'd all go in directions, you know, and there'd be two of us go down this road, two going down this road, and we'd each take a side. Anyway, that's how we do it. So we're in the van, and the guys who are supposed to be knowing where we're going are up there directing and leading, and it's clear to me that they're completely lost. And one guy, wasn't me, but one guy spoke up and he said, you know, we're here to try to save this town. We're the most lost folks in this town, he said. That is a problem. It's a problem when the church is trying to save everybody and they're lost in the worst sense of the term. And that's what was going on here. And Paul said, something's got to change. You people are trying to save the world. You don't realize the damage you're doing in claiming Christ's name and behaving like you do. What is that old song we like to sing? We are the only Bible the careless world will read. That is a great old song. And it is so true. The world is too careless to read God's word. I tell you who it reads is you and me. And so, you know, in John chapter 17, I know the print is very small here, I'm sorry, but John 17 and verse 20, this is a familiar verse, I hope. This is a part of what we sometimes might rightly call the Lord's Prayer, his own prayer, as he prayed there at the brook Kidron before he went into Gethsemane. He prayed, among other things, these words, neither pray I for these alone, talking about the apostles, but for them also which shall believe on me through their word. That he says, that they all might be one. As thou, Father, art in me and I in thee, that they may be one in us, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me. I'll tell you, when brethren are fighting each other and carrying on in ungodly ways, can you imagine taking each other to law? What does that look like in the community? What does that look like to the world? In 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 23, different point and yet I think a similar problem. Paul said, you ought to think about what your assemblies look like. You have people there who've been gifted with the gift of tongues, and so they're here blabbing away in a language nobody understands, nobody's interpreting. He said, people that come into your assembly will think you're out of your mind, that you're some sort of babbling, insane person. Do you ever think about that, he said? You ever think about how this makes Christ look, the way you conduct yourself? In that sense, it's the same principle, isn't it? In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 12, this is so great. Peter really speaks to the same principle that Paul is trying to get the church at Corinth to see. 1 Peter 2 and verse 12. 1 Peter chapter, verse 12. In the ESV it reads, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. They're going to have to admit, I don't like to say it, but I'll tell you, those guys are right. Those guys care. Those guys are real. Those guys have principles. It's like one fellow put it, what message does it send to unbelievers when Christ appears to have made so little impact on those who follow him? How degrading is it to the Holy Spirit to suggest that born-again believers can't resolve a minor dispute among themselves? What kind of ammunition does it give those who are opposed to the gospel of Jesus to slander the church? We might put it this way. How can anybody claim to have any concern for the Lord when they act the way they do sometimes? Verse 7. Now therefore there is utterly a fault among you, because ye go to law with one another. Why do you not rather take wrong? Why do you not rather suffer yourselves to be defrauded? There's utterly a fault. Other translations read there, to have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Another reads, the very fact that you have legal disputes among yourselves shows that you have failed completely. I like again this quote. I think this comment worth including here. Lenski explains it this way. He said, the fact that you have all these disputes with each other is in general a decided loss. You ought to settle your own disputes. And what's far more important, you ought not to be having, you ought to be above having disputes. For the greatest loss lies in having them at all. A great loss in honor and in dignity, an equally great loss in Christian fellowship and love. Matters ought never to arrive at a point where it's necessary to have litigations, no matter who adjudicates them. There's a point to be made there. A lot of things went wrong before it ever got to the stage that Paul is condemning. I think we all can agree with that. So he says, why not take the wrong? Why not just take the wrong? Why not suffer the loss? That seems crazy to the world. It doesn't seem crazy to you because you've been influenced by Christ. And we know that the gospel teaches the value of sacrifice sometimes. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 3 beginning. Paul said, verse 2, I fulfill you my joy that you be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory. But he said, let each esteem other better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. And if you're having trouble getting this picture, he says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. What did he do for us? Well, he left heaven for us, and he became man for us, and he died on a cross for us. And that's a great point. So, 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 17, it's better, if the will of God be so, that you suffer for well-doing than for evil-doing. For Christ also hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened or made alive by the Spirit. 1 Peter 4 and verse 15, let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, a busybody in other men's matters. But if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed. Let him glorify God in this behalf. What if the Lord himself who taught us the lesson? You've heard it hath been said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. They sure had heard that. They'd read that in Moses' law. But I say to you that you resist not evil. Whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man will sue thee at law and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him too. Give to him that asketh thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn not away. Some of the hardest words in the Bible, it seems to me. It's not easy, but it's a test. It's a test of how much we trust God and what our real commitment is. And as one fellow put it, remember this. Remember that if Christ demanded his rights, none of us would be here today, sitting here as forgiven people. That's a fact. So, he concludes our section by saying, no, you won't listen to that. You won't take the love of Christ in your heart and let it live in your life. He said, instead, you do wrong and defraud, and that your brethren. You do wrong. You cause injury to other people. That's the source, that's the beginning of the trouble. Somebody's been wrong. Somebody does the wrong. You defraud. You cheat somebody else. It's the same word that's used in chapter 7 and verse 5 about a married couple not defrauding one another. We'll talk about that soon. It's the same term that's used in James chapter 5 and verse 4 when James writes about the wealthy defrauding those who worked for them. He said, behold, the hire of the laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you, is kept back by fraud. And they cry to me, and the cries of them that have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts. God hears. There's plenty of that goes on in the world every day. But here it's especially bad because it's brother cheating, wronging, returning evil for evil with his brother. You know, it's never good to do wrong to somebody, but there is something special about brotherhood. Is that not true? How do we make sense of Galatians 6 otherwise in verse 10? As you therefore have opportunity, let us do good to all men, especially those of the household of faith. It heightens the offense whenever we would choose to treat a brother with that kind of contempt. Now, I'd like to just quit right here, but I think it'd be a little bit of a cheat. So I'm going to go one step further, and I'm going to ask you with great care to listen to what I say and reject it if it's not true. But somebody might rightly ask, are there any exceptions to this rule? I think that the challenge to me of this passage, the great challenge, is not so much what it says as what it does not say. And what it does not do is it does not talk about any exceptions to the rule that we have just given. I think there are other passages that lead us to question. Is there any exception? Is there any time a brother may take another Christian to law? What are we to do with Matthew 19:9? Jesus said, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except it be for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. Implying that a man may take his wife to court and sue her. Divorce is a legal process. And if he does so for the proper reason, he has not sinned, and he may have a right even to marry another. And I have never thought of that as being something that did not apply between two Christians who were married. And so if that's the case, then we would have a situation where there are some exceptions to this, what seems to be an absolute principle. What others might we give? What else could we consider in this regard? Well, I think we need to be very careful that we don't just allow convenience to do away with the passage. I'd offer this thought, that, and this has been offered by many others, that when the Lord gave civil government, he intended to use it in order for the protection of the innocent. Sometimes it doesn't work that way, but God gave the civil government to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. That's Romans 13, verse 4. And so if a man suffers evil doing, if a man's life is threatened, for example, does he have a right to appeal to civil authority? Paul seems to, an approved example in Acts chapter 25, I should say. When he was threatened to be handed over to the mob and he appealed to Caesar, he was already in custody. This is an appeals court. This seems to be an approved example of a Christian using the civil authority to protect his life. So I would have to admit, in this case, thankfully, the threat did not come from another Christian. But the principle of civil government being used to protect one's life, I think would still need to be considered. Let me offer one more point that I think we need to consider as we're trying to make application of this principle. And it's this, that while there's no exception given in our passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, there is a context here. And what is the context? The context is that you ought not to take your brother to law to solve problems. What should you do? Take it to the church. Now, I ask you as a fellow Bible student, does that limit the scope of the passage? I think it may. In other words, what you're asked to do is you're asked to take to the church what you're taking to the courts. The fact is, there's some things that the church is just not equipped to deal with. Some things it may deal with, but it cannot fully deal with every situation. Thinking about the language that's used here, some of this would suggest that, well, the smallest matters. Now, he may have been speaking here again rather ironically, but he's talking about matters that can be solved among people without any other involvement of some other agency or worldly agency. Cases dealing with this life, he calls it in chapter 6 and verse 4. It can and must deal with its spiritual responsibilities. 1 Corinthians 5 reminds us of that. But the church is not set up to deal with every kind of problem. Suppose, and just as an example, you have a situation where a person who is a Christian, they're not living like it, they claim to be. Maybe at one time they obeyed the gospel. But in the state they're in now, they're working for the devil, and what they do is they threaten the life of a fellow Christian physically. Maybe they take the life of a fellow Christian. Is that a matter the church can handle completely? Well, it can handle some of it. It certainly can condemn what's evil. But I don't think any of us here would suggest that we can't take this murderer to law. We can't call the law on the fellow because he's a Christian. That seems to be outside the realm of what he's looking at here. What he seems to be focusing on are things that the church can handle. It ought to handle all it can, but some things may be beyond what the church is equipped to do. We give some other, you could just make your own list there, child molestation as a crime, or child custody as a question. There may be things that a local church, it certainly can reason with people, but it can't solve some issues. And in some cases, there would have to be some, perhaps, governmental involvement in these matters. Consider that for what it's worth, and you might straighten me out on that if you think I've gotten off the path. By the way, I tell you, in preparation for this lesson over the last several weeks, I've thought about these questions before, obviously, but I'm trying to think about all this anew. And I called up a number of guys that I thought were a lot smarter than me, and I said, won't you tell me the answer to this? And I don't think any of them had all the answers to this either. So I thought, well, maybe I'm not the only guy to struggle with this question. You may not struggle with it. Good for you. You can help me now. But anyway, there are some questions there. One thing I think is clear, we were talking this morning about, we touched on the marriage law, and I think a very good point was made. We didn't this morning. We just looked at Luke 16. We didn't talk about the exception. And of course we didn't, and Luke doesn't in that case, and Mark doesn't in Mark 10. Matthew certainly does, and it does apply. But it's okay sometimes just to talk about the law and not the exception, isn't it? And the law is clear. And I think the law is clear in this case. Whatever might be outside the scope of this passage, what's in the passage is plain. Don't do wrong to one another. You're brethren. And to cause this grief of your brother is a wickedness in God's eyes. Secondly, if we are wrong, don't retaliate in kind. Don't get the unbeliever involved in a matter that you can and should be able to settle between you. And if you can't, the church certainly can. It shames the name of Christ when you don't handle your own business and look to the world to solve your problems. Better to take the wrong than to cause a wrong to the name of and the work of the Lord. And I think that is clear enough. And I hope those lessons will affect my heart. Okay. Well, we'll pause there. And we'll pick up at some point here in 1 Corinthians 6 and finish out this great chapter. If you haven't already, please take your songbooks out and turn to the number that's been selected. And it's a great privilege to be a Christian. It's a great responsibility as well. But you know, the truth is everybody's responsible to obey their Creator. It's just some people are working at it and some are not. On the last day, you don't get any gold stars by saying, well, you know, I was afraid I'd fail as a Christian, so I just never did. I never did decide to be one. Guess what? That doesn't win anything for you. So for those of us who are in the fight, let's take courage in the fact that we're where we need to be. And if you're not in the fight, if you're not one of His own, if you're not fighting for the Lord's cause, my prayer, my hope is that you might make a decision even tonight to obey the gospel. Maybe you're here as one who is a child of God. You started but you're not serving him right now, and you know that in your heart. Make it right with him. Anything it takes, whatever confession needs to be made, whatever prayers need to be offered, let them be. Let us help you. Let's help each other so that we might be able one day to be in a better place together, having won the battle, having overcome. God, help us to that end. If we can help you right now to get back on that road, we ask you to let us know how. While we stand and sing, will you come?